Today's daf is daf Zayin, and we'll begin towards the bottom of daf Vav Amud Beis. I'll tell you in just a second where we're going to begin, but first let me give you a little background. I'm sure you know this. There's the sheet of Ben Beseira, and the question that's on the agenda is if someone who's pasul liavoda, like for example a zar, would go ahead and do the kmitza of a korban mincha, is it ball game over, as we would say, or can we introduce a kohen kosher to redo the kmitza? Now, Ben Beseira only spoke about a case, explicitly only spoke about a case where the kohen kosher did the kmitza with his left hand, and that disqualifies the korban mincha. And that's where Ben Beseira came along with his chiddush, and he said, no, let's just bring in another, let's just ask the Kohen to redo the kmitza, and this time get it right with his right hand. Rav says that Ben Beseira should be extended, and the sheet of Ben Beseira, and this is what, according to Rav, Ben Beseira actually meant, was that any kind of disqualification in the kmitza, for example, as we mentioned before, by a non-Kohen, can be corrected by introducing a Kohen. And the Gemara is trying to understand why Rav felt compelled to add this. Wouldn't have been obvious. So now we're going to start with Elataima Dashmeinon Rav. So again, it's hard for me to show you exactly where this is. I hope we're all on Daf Vav Amud Beis. Vav Amud Beis. And if you see, there's a Tosus Divrei Maskil Ella, and below that a Tosus Divrei Maskil Mimokom. So right between those two Tosusin, you'll see a line that starts with the words Samich Le. Now we're going to start with the third word in that line. So again, how many lines it is from the bottom? I would say approximately 20 lines up from the bottom. I can't be exactly sure. But anyway, Elataima Dashmin and Rav. Why did Rav have to go out of his way to explicitly tell us that the leniency of Ben Beseira that allows for a Kohen Kosher to fix up that which was messed up by in the first Kmitza, namely when he used his left hand, and Rav had to tell me that that principle of fixing up the Kmitza will apply even in a case where the original Kmitza, the Mincha, was done by a non-Kohen. Holav hachi, if not for Rav, what would I have thought? Hava min, I would have entertained the idea that Bishar Psulim Pasar Ben Beseira, meaning that Ben Beseira would admit to the Shita of the Chachamim that in other psulim, like for example, if a non-Kohen Azar would have done the Kmitza, then it's ball game over. It's fafalin. You can't fix that up. And now the Gemara is going to say, well, that Havamina in understanding Ben Beseiro is impossible. V'atanya, we have a brisa that says, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Loza, Rabbi Shimon Omrim. So we have two Tanoim in the brisa that are recorded as saying, Machshir Hoya Ben Beseiro b'chol hapsulim kulam. Ben Beseiro's leniency, allowing fixing up that which was messed up in the first Kmitza, applies to all the different psulim. So we have here in the brisa explicitly that Ben Beseira rules that in all cases of a Kmitza psula, you could just bring in the Kohen and have him redo it and do it right. Visanya, and the brisa says explicitly that v'kamatz misham, that we darshan the pasuk of v'kamatz misham, and how do we interpret the words misham? And here we have machlokas tanoim, how to interpret that the Kohen takes the kometz misham, from there. What's from there? So we have the Shita the Tanakama who explains the word Misham as referring to Makom Sharagli Azar Omdos, which means that the purpose of this pasuk is to teach us that even though Kmitza in a mincha should really be upgraded and classified under Kodshe Kodshim, which would require that the Kmitza be implemented in the Tzafon, the northern part of the Azara, nevertheless, Sham, right? The Torah went out of its way to say Sham, Misham, meaning even from a place where the non-Kohanim are allowed into the Azara, which is a shetach, how do you say in English? An area of 11 amos, and that's where the non-Kohanim are allowed into the Azara. But the point is that the Kamatz Misham is teaching me that the entire Azara is suitable for Kmitza. However, Ben Beseira has a different take on the drasha of the Kamatz Misham, and he understands that Minayin Shem Kamatz Bismol. How do we know that if the Kmitza was implemented by the Kohen with his left hand, Sheyachzor v'yikmotz biyamin, he could just simply retake the Kometz and do it right with his right hand. Talmud Lomar v'Kamatz Misham mimakom shekamatz kvar. He takes it from the place where the Kmitza was already done, but it was done improperly. It was done with the left hand instead of the right hand. V'keva de cross stomach sivbe, the pasuk here of a Kamatz Misham that says he goes back to that place where he implemented an incorrect and an invalid Kmitza, and he does the Kmitza again. The Torah doesn't specify that that's only in a case of an invalid Kmitza as a result of using his left hand, but rather stomach sivbe. The Torah uses a general term without specifying mali small and mali sharp sulit. So once again, we're stuck with the question of why Rav felt compelled to tell me that the leniency of Ben Beseira applies to all psulim, and that's explicit in the Bryce. I don't need Rav for that. So the Gemara says, "Alaha kamashmal on Rav, kamatz vafilu kidesh ulafuki mehani tanoi." We're about to embark upon a study of the entire process of bringing a korban mincha and all the avoda of the Kohen. Now, what we have to understand is that there's a double process here. There's a process of kmitza, and then there's a process of kiddush, which means to sanctify the korban. And you might have said, as we'll soon see is the opinion of some Tanoim, that Ben Beseira would only be lenient, allowing the Kohen to redo the Kmitza if the Kmitza had only reached stage number 1, but not if it reached stage number 2, if it was already after Kiddush. Now that Kiddush will apply inside a Klishares. So when the korban mincha is placed into a klishares, we have a principle that klishares is makadesh, that which is betocha, whatever inside of it. And the Sanya, we learned in a brayso, the Rabbi Yossi ben Yassi and Rabbi Yehuda Hanachton Amru, but Dvarim Amurim, when does Ben Beseira apply this kula? That you could redo the kmitza, that's only kamatz v'lo kiddush. It's only if it arrived at stage number 1. Avol Kiddush, if it arrived already at stage number 2, and the entire Kometz and the Mincha was placed into a Klisharis that sanctified it, Pasal. According to these Tanoim, Ben Beseira would not go as far as to say that there's a possibility of fixing up the Mincha. The Mincha is already a psula once it got to the stage of Kiddush. Now again, why do these Tanoim assume that once the Kiddush was implemented, it's too late to go back and fix up the Kmitza? That's what we're going to have to see in the Gemara Lahalon. But be that as it may, Rav is going to disagree with these Tanoim and their interpretation of Ben Beseira, and Rav is going to go as far as to say that Ben Beseira's leniency to allow for rectifying the Kmitza with the second Kmitza applies even after Kiddush, even after the second stage. The Ika Diamri, there's another understanding of Rav, Kamatz in Kiddush Lo. Maybe what Rav is saying is just the opposite. Rav is coming to agree with those Tanoim in their interpretation of Ben Beseira to establish that when did Ben Beseira allow for fixing up the Kmitza when it was done improperly? That's only before Kiddush. But Kiddush Lo, Kiman Kahani Tanoi, like those Tanoim, Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda, Lafuke Mitanakama. Now, in the Brisa, the first Tana is not mentioned. That's not true what I just said. It is mentioned, but it's not printed on the page. But if we had in front of us the entire Brisa, we would see that the Tanakama of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi are of the opinion that Ben Beseira went as far as to allow for rectification of the Kmitza even after Kiddush. And Rav here is coming to tell us that he accepts the Chumra Dika approach of those Tanoim that disagree with the Tanakama's interpretation of Ben Beseira. Maskif lo Rav Nachman, my kasavri hani Tanoi. Rav Nachman wants to now analyze the opinion of Rabbi Yossi and Rav Nachman and Rabbi Yehuda, in their limitation of the leniency of Ben Beseira. And now Rav Nachman is going to ask what we call a mimonavshach. Mimonavshach means no matter how you how you slice the cake. Kmitzas psulin avodahi. If we were to say, and here we're getting into a whole sugya about whether kmitza is called an avoda or it's not, meaning kmitza is the first stage of a korban mincha, in terms of the Seder Avoda, and it parallels Shechita in the case of Zvachim. Now, Shechita in Zvachim can be implemented by a non-Kohen, which might be indicative, again, we have to learn a little bit more about Paraduma for this, but that the Shechita is not upgraded to the status of an Avoda, and therefore Kmitza might not be an Avoda. So now Rav Nachman is going to ask me, Monavshach, is Kmitza an Avoda or is it not? If you're going to tell me that Kmitza is an avoda. And even if a apostle, let's say a non-Kohen, would implement a kmitza, then it's an avoda. In other words, in shechita of zvachim, we say that it's not an avoda. Therefore, a non-Kohen could implement the shechita. But now we're saying that in kmitza, maybe we say that kmitza is not like an avoda, not like shechita, and there it does qualify as an avoda. And therefore, the very moment that the kmitza was implemented by a apostle, then the mincha is psula, and then Ben Beseira could not possibly extend his leniency to include the case of kmitza by apostle. And afagav avile matan kli, it doesn't matter whether or not the kmitza was done by the non-Kohen before it was put into the Kli and it was sanctified, or even after, and how much more so afterwards it was put into the Kli. Because we're saying now that a apostle did an avoda. Like, for example, in Zvachim, if let's say the Kabbalas Hadam, or the Holochas Hadam, or the Zrikas Hadam was implemented by a non-Kohen, by me or Steve, then the korban would be apostle. And the same thing is going to apply now to Kmitza, if it was done by a non-Kohen, if we elevate and classify Kmitza as an avoda. And if, on the other hand, you take the other approach, that Kmitzas psulim lav avodahi, that we don't elevate the status of Kmitza to an avoda such that when the apostle, non-Kohen, let's say, implements Kmitza, then it's not considered avoda. If that be the case, then nothing happened over here. There was never an avoda. And therefore, matan kli mai hava. Why did these Tanoim assume that after the kmitza was put into a kli and it was sanctified, there's no possibility of rectifying it? Well, nothing was done. there was no kmitza. The kmitza doesn't register on the Richter scale because it's not an avoda. Hadar Rav Nachman. Now Rav Nachman comes to answer his own question, and he says, "Liolam avoda." I'm going to go back to my original assumption that the kmitza is an avoda, but lo gamra avodasa adi ovid le matan kli. The avoda of kmitza, according to Rav Nachman's final conclusion, has a two-part process, and that process integrates both the actual kmitza and the kiddush kli. And therefore, if the Kiddush Kli has not yet happened, then even though the non-Kohen's Kmitza was a Kmitza of an Avoda, but it wasn't a complete Avoda. It was only the beginning of an Avoda, and therefore it doesn't register yet, and therefore there's still a possibility, according to Ben Beseira, of rectifying it. But if that Kmitza of a non-Kohen, which is an Avoda, culminated with Kiddush Kli, that's when these Tanoim that we mentioned before, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, they hold that Ben Beseira would concede that there's no possibility of fixing it up because the Kmitza was an Avoda. The Avoda was an Avoda Psula because it was implemented by a non-Kohen, and that's it. The ball game over. So the Gemara asks, if so, afilu lo kidesh. If you're telling me that the status of Kmitza is that of an avoda, and a non-Kohen who does the avoda is possible. So what difference does it make whether or not there was Kiddush Kli or there wasn't Kiddush Kli? Even if there wasn't Kiddush Kli, the mincha has to be possible. And now we're going to start today's daf. And why is that so? The chi on daf zayin, the chi mahadele lekometz leduchte tikdosh v'lif sol. What's going to happen now is when he, and now we have to figure out what the word he is here. He means He, right? And lay is the Aramaic for he. He places the komets back in the original kli where he did the kmitza. Now let's understand, there are two kalim here. We're going to have a whole sugi about that later on. There's a klishares number 1 and klishares number 2. Klishares number 1 is where the original kmitza was done. The flour and oil mixture was put into a klishares, but the full sanctification will only take place after the actual kmitza. So first, stage 1, they put the flour, etc., into the kli. That's kli number 1. Stage number 2 is when the Kohen does the kmitza in the first kli. Then he takes the komets from the first kli and pours it into a second kli. And the second kli really clinches the kiddush, the sanctification. And therefore, the Gemara now raises the following objection. I don't get it. If you're holding that the kmitza of a non-Kohen is an avoda, and therefore it passes the avoda, so then what's going to happen now? We're going to try to get that komets into the second kli to continue the process of sanctification. Once it's sanctified in the second kli, then it's a mincha psula. So actually, what the Gemara is saying, as an objection to Rav Nachman, is that there's really no difference between returning the komets into the first kli where we started and taking it into the second kli. So once, according to Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, the halacha is that the mincha became psula because of the komets. And now, what happened? They did the kiddush kli in the second kli. The Gemara says that, what are you telling me? You're telling me that Ben Beseira would not validate the second Kohen who replaced the first Kohen because there was a kiddush in the second kli? Are you implying that if they put the komets back into the first kli, then it would be okay? What difference does it make? there was already a kiddush in the first kli. Rabbi Yochanan Zolsameres kli sharis ein mekachin elamidas. What happens is that if the Kohen will now put the komets back into the first kli, he's going to have in mind that he doesn't want that kiddush to take place. Why? Because that kiddush was implemented by a non-Kohen. So therefore, there's a fundamental difference between returning the komets back into the first kli as opposed to putting it into the second kli. If he returns it into the first kli, what are you saying? You're saying that now that is a kiddush of the mincha psula in the first kli, and that's going to upset the and invalidate the mincha? No, no, no. We have halacha, says the Gemara in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that kli sharis ein mekadesh el midas. He's got to have a deliberate intention to put it into the kli such that the kli will be mekadesh. Without that intention, the kli will not be mekadesh. The Gemara says hamidas mekadshim. The implication is, of course, that if it was placed back into the first kli deliberately for the purpose of kiddush, it would be mekadeshit. And I don't get it, because Reish Lakish had a doubt about this, and he asked his Rebbe, "V'aboy minei Reish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan kli sharis maushi kach psulin lechatchila li karev." So let's say a zar implemented kmitza. He put the kmitza, of course, in that first kli sharis, and now Reish Lakish wants to know: would it now effectuate let's say if the Kohen Kosher now puts the komets back into the original kli, would that effectuate a kiddush that was implemented by a Kohen Kosher? Therefore, now we could take the kmitza and we could burn it on the mizbeach. And Amalei, and this is what Rabbi Yochanan responded to him: Ein mekadshim li korev. You can't take something that was already possible and now be mekadesh it back into the kli such that now we can burn it on the mizbeach. That's impossible, because there's already a psul in the carbon. But if that be the case, then Rabbi Yochanan seems to be saying now that the returning of the kmitza back into the first kli doesn't really effectuate anything, because he's saying that ein mekadshim li karet. Right? If the return of the komets back into the first kli would have been an act of kiddush that would be valid, then now we could burn it on the mizbeach. No, Rabbi Yochanan says we can't burn it on the mizbeach because it goes back into the original kli and it was possible. So the Gemara answers, "Aval mekadshim li posel." It's not that Rabbi Yochanan was saying that the kiddush itself is totally meaningless and it doesn't register at all. No. Rabbi Yochanan agrees that the kiddush is meaningful when it goes back into the original kli, but only li pasal, not li karev. So in other words, we get the negative, the chumrah, but not the positive, not the kula. We cannot use that kiddush back in the first kli in order to now sort of replace the original psul in the kmitza with a kiddush of a Kohen Kosher, and now we can be machshir it such that we can burn it on the mizbeach like any mincha. Nay, that we can't do. But what we can do is we have to recognize the validity, so to speak, of the kiddush going back into the first kli to the extent in which it's now possible. Okay, now the Gemara wants to know, back to the scoreboard, why did Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda insist that? Oh, Steve has to leave. Wow. Okay, you'll be very close to where I am. Okay, so again, we'll try to do whatever we can in the next few minutes. And I think Don is here. I'm not sure. I see a picture of him, but maybe he's here. Oh, there he is. Okay, good. So now the Gemara wants to offer another interpretation of these two Tanoim who hold that if the Kometz um, was not yet sanctified by the non-Kohen, then Ben Beseira allows you to substitute a Kohen kosher and be machsher it. And the Kometz is taken by this Zar, and it doesn't become sanctified. It doesn't become Kiddush, which would invalidate the Mincha. And when it returns back to the original Kli, that's not an act of Kiddush, like we said before, because he doesn't have Kavana to be Makadish. But now we're offering Rav Amr's shot. Kigon shehechziro levisa gedusha. Here's a case where putting a mincha into a kli sharis will not be mekadosh. Forget about the other discussion we had whether it was ladas or not. Namely, if the flour rises and roll and how should I say over what's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, it goes over the top of the rim of the kli sharis because a kli sharis can only mekadosh that which is inside the kli. But here, what happened is he heaped up the mincha above the outside of the kli, the rim of the kli, and therefore, when the kometz is put into the kli, basically part of the kometz at least is sitting above the kli, not in the inside of the kli, and therefore it doesn't become sanctified. There's no kiddush, because the principle is that the kiddush can only be effectuated by that which is inside the kli. So the Gemara objects. Wait a second. We said that there was a kmitza. Now he's putting it back into the kli sharis. So how did he get the kmitza if it was heaped over the side of the rim? Ela kagon shech zero levisa. Visa is the name of the kli that's used for a mincha. Hich zero levisa tfufa. Right? What he does is that originally there was a kiddush that was done with everything that was inside the vessel. But when he put the vessel back, when he put the komets back into the vessel, it was rounded. In other words, the kmitza was done on flour that was inside the vessel. So the Gemara says, "Came in the komets le ki mahader legave de mona kamahadele." Right? So why not say that he puts it back into the kli exactly as he took it out of the kli? And the Gemara says, "Michi mahadele manach le adafna de mona." Right? He puts it on the side of the vessel. Umenayid le v'nofal mimila. And now what happens is there's like a hole inside the mincha, inside the kli. He starts shaking it up. And what happens as a result is some of the flour will go in directly into that hole inside the kli as a result of his shaking. But what happens here is that his shaking is not considered as if he put it back into the hole, back into the inside of the vessel, but rather it's considered memela, as if it happened memela. You see the word memela, that's the key word here. In other words, there's no what we call kol gavra. It wasn't his direct action. Amalei Rabbi Yomi Rabbi Zera v'lukma kagon shech zero lekli amunach agabi karka. What's the deal if you put a kometz into a vessel that's sitting on the karka? The Kohen is not holding on to the vessel in his hand. So that would have been a perfect example of a situation in which the replacement of the kometz into the kli it's not makadesh because the kli is al gabi karka. It's not in the hands of the Kohen. El shmamino komtzin mi kli shal gabi karka. We're going to derive from this the fact that this Metzius was not offered as an opportunity to explain why the returning of the kmitza to the kli is not makadeshit. We must assume that you don't have to have the kli in the hands of the Kohen. The kli could be on the ground. So Abzera says to him, we had this question. The Rabbi Avimi Tani Menachos Bei Rav Chizda. Okay, now here the Gemara goes into a whole digression. we're assuming here that Rav Avimi studied under the tutelage of Rav Chizda, and he asked him this question about whether or not you could have kiddush on a kli that's on the ground, not in the hands of the Kohen. But Vavimi be Rav Chizda Tani. Are you telling me that Avimi was a student of Rav Chizda? Va'omar Rav Chizda Kulfei Tavi Bali Avimi Alod Shmaita. In other words, Avimi's testifying that he got it over the head many times. I'm sorry, Rav Chizda is testifying that he got it over the head many times from Avimi, from his Rebbe. For example, Bala Hachriz Ritzufin Shloshim Yom, Sheni V'chamishi Shishin Yomi. So what happened was that Rav Avimi taught the shir about what we do with the possessions of the Yisomim, of the orphans, and we have to sort of try to get a price for their possessions on the market before we sell them. So for 30 days consecutively, we put it on auction, so to speak, and we announce, hey, we're selling property of an orphan, and we'll see who's going to be the highest bidder for those 30 days. Alternatively, if they can't do it daily, then they do it on Mondays and Thursdays, which are the market days, and then we extend it to 60 days. In any event, Rav Chizda was studying at Rav Avimi's footsteps. Rav Avimi gave it to him over the head. He didn't remember the sugya that they learned about how to shatz up the value of the property of the orphans. So the Gemara answers, Vavimi Masechta is akra is akule. Rav Avimi had some sort of a seizure in which he forgot the Masechta that he himself taught Rav Chizda, namely Masechta Menachos. So what did he do? Also, Rav Chizda ladkure gamri. He went back to Rav Chizda and he said, Rav Chizda, please remind me of everything we learned together in Masechta Menachos. So Gemara asks, wait a minute, if Rav Avimi is the Rebbe and he wants Rav Chizda to review with him that which they learned, why didn't he summon Rav Chizda to come and study to him? Why did he go to Rav Chizda? And here the Gemara formulates a principle: Tzavar hachi mistaya milsa tfe. The more effort you put in, the more sweat and toil, even if it's physical discomfiture, the greater the Torah is, and the more it lasts in your mind. And therefore, Rav Avimi felt that if he would call in Rav Chizda, he's not really doing any effort really much. So he wanted to add and upgrade his effort, and therefore he went to Rav Chizda to his Talmud. Now we get back to the Gemara after that digression. Paga be Rav Nachman Amarle. Rav Nachman came in contact with Rav Avimi, and Rav Avimi at that time was studying Menachos under the tutelage of Rav Chizda, and he said, Keitzad Komtzen, how do you do Kmitza? And Rav Avimi, to his surprise, pointed to a kli on the ground, and he said to me, Kli zeh, Amarle. So Rav Nachman was surprised. Are you telling me that the reason you pointed to a kli that's on the karka is to teach me that you could be makadesh in a kli that's not in the hands of the kohen, but it's on the ground? Amalei de magbale kohen. What I meant is that the kohen lifts it up. It's a bit strange because he pointed to a vessel that was on the ground, and he really meant that the vessel's in the hands, lifted up in the hands of the kohen. Now Rav Nachman asked Rav Avimi another question. Right? Until now, we were talking about the kmitza that has to be in a kli sharis. Now we're talking about the kiddush, right, that comes after the kmitza, and the kohen is not holding on to the kli. Amalei no snola kli. Again, he points to the floor. There's a kli on the floor. And he says, put it into this kli. So if Nachman says, Amalei de magbale kohen, the kohen is lifting up the kli. Amalei, so if Nachman says, Im kain hutzachta shlosha kohanim, you're going to need, by definition, a minimum of 3 kohanim for the kmitza. One is going to do the kmitza, and he's going to, and the other kohen is holding on to the vessel, to the kli. And now the first kohen who does the kmitza places the komets into the vessel. So we already have 2 kohanim, and then we need a third kohen, because we take the kmitza from the first kli and we sanctify it in another kli. So we're going to need a kohen now to hold on to the second kli. Again, the same kohen could do the kmitza and then put it into the second kli, but I need 2 different kohenim to hold on to the two different kelim. Amalei, so Rav Imi said, what do you care if you need three kohanim? Utehei tzricha shlosha ketamid. The Gemara says in Masechet Yoma that the Tamid required no less than 13 kohanim. It was such a complicated hakrava of the daily carbon Tamid that it requires. So you see that you can even have 13 kohanim together that implement the avoda. So don't be nispal and don't be upset if we need three kohanim for kmitza. Eisvei Rav Nachman says, wait a minute, are you telling me we need three kohanim for a kmitza? And that's because we need kohanim to hold on to the kli into which the kmitza is done and poured. What are you going to do with a mishnah in this parak? Later on in this parak, it says Ze'aklal kol hakometz v'nosem bekli. Okay, we're getting a list of all those avodos that require a kohen. First of all, we need a kohen for kmitza. Secondly, we need a kohen to put it into a kli, and then a molich. Right, you got to get the kometz onto the mizbeach, onto the pyre. So you need another kohen to bring it to the pyre. Then you have the makta, the one who pours it onto the fire. And lechol davar shedarkol lechol. He has to have intention to eat that which is usually eaten. Anyway, ilu makbia lo ktani. Why didn't the Mishnah exhaust all the requirements of a Kohen, including Magbia, meaning that the Kohen has to lift up the Kli before the Kometz is put into the Kli? And the Gemara answers, Avime answers, Tana Seder Avodas Nokav Lo Seder Kohanim. What the Mishnah is doing is it's clarifying all the different avodos and the sequence in which all these avodos of the mincha are implemented, but it's not counting Kohanim. We're not going into, well, which Kohen do we need this, and how many different Kohanim, and could one Kohen do two things, and so forth and so on. Boy, Minei Rav Sheish, it's the same question that we had until now, as to whether or not the Kiddush in the Kli requires that the Kohen lift up the Kli off the ground. That question was raised by Rav Sheish. Ma'u likmos v'kli shal gabi karka, amalei, and Rav Sheish himself answered this question, and he said, Pok chazi my avdin lego. Go out and see what they did at the time of the Mikdash. Again, Rav Sheshes was many generations after the Churban. But let's see if we can find a Mishnah, and from the Mishnah that describes the Avoda, we can gather by equation and arrive at a conclusion about whether or not the Kli has to be held by the Kohen. And we're going to learn now a Mishnah at the end of Masechet Menachos about the lechem aponim. Lechem aponim is also a mincha, and it says arba kohanim u'chnasim. We need 4 kohanim. Let's explain. There's sidur and there's siluk, meaning one Shabbos you do the sidur. You have 2 kohanim. Each kohen is going to put 6 loaves on 2 sides of the shulchan. Those loaves will last on the shulchan for 1 week until the following Shabbos. On the following Shabbos, we have siluk. Siluk means we take the breads off of the shulchan. So we need 2 kohanim for the placing of the breads at the beginning of the week, meaning on Shabbos, onto the shulchan. And then we need another 2 kohanim the following Shabbos to remove it, all told, arba kohanim. Shnayim b'yodam shnei starim, shnayim b'yodam shnei bezichim. Now, it also requires 4 kohanim even for the sidur, which means that we're going to need another 4 kohanim for the siluk. Why? Because every lechem aponim has to be accompanied by levona. Levona, I think, is called in English frankincense or something like that. And there are 2 spoons, which are called bezichin. A bazich is a spoon. The kohen spoons a full spoon's worth of levona, of this spice, and it has to be accompanied. So now we have 2 kohanim, each carrying 6 loaves of lechem haponim, putting 6 loaves, this one on this side of the shulchan, this one keneged corresponding another 6, and we have 2 other kohanim, besides the 2 kohanim 6 and 6, we have 2 kohanim, each one is bringing one of the 2 bezichin, and that's in order to be mesader it. And then when we want to be Masalika, we take it off the following Shabbos, Shnayim Litol Shnei Starim, Ushnayim Litol Shnei Bezichin. Likewise, we're going to need two Kohanim to take each one, respectively, 6 chalos, lechem aponim, from last week, and it's given to the Kohanim to eat. And we're going to need 2 Kohanim to take the Bazichin. Okay, now we move on into a study of these numbers here, the